Obviously, this is a lecture on what I call it, I believe in the full title is Hexes, Curses, and the Destruction of One's Enemies. And this brings up a lot of interesting questions for us as anyone who's interested in the occult or ceremonial magic. If you look at the traditional grimoire systems, they're filled with examples of using magic to destroy your enemies. It's a prevalent thing that comes up constantly, like learning new knowledge or discovering treasure. Some of these things that are just in basically every magical system has a formula for it. And what makes that especially interesting to me is because there's a great deal of hostility in the occult community to this idea right now. So I want to look at some of the practical aspects and some of the ethical aspects of this process. But first, we'll start with just basic technology. Aleister Crowley defines magic as creating change in conformity with will. So part of our wills means that we're going to have certain objectives, certain things that we're going after, certain changes we want to create, and eventually it is inevitable that someone will become an obstacle to those changes. And this means that we're going to have to strike out in some way, try to overcome the obstacle in some way. To do it without any form of hostility is, I think, frankly naive. You can have the idea, like we see in the Book of the Law, that we should experience conflict with other human beings as brothers might experience them to a certain extent, but also to trample them down, to overcome those obstacles. Not to have necessarily animosity towards the person, but certainly to remove them as an obstacle. What this relies on is one of the most basic principles of ceremonial magic. Agrippa and Levi called it the astral light. Crowley refers to it as the magical link more specifically. But anytime that you're actually going to attempt to destroy someone with magic, or to destroy an enemy with magic, or to launch an attack on a person or an institution, or even a place, it relies on this basic principle. And it strikes right at the heart of what ceremonial magic actually is, because what we're talking about essentially is certain gestures, certain words, certain actions that, if performed in a particular context, will actually manipulate causality. And this means that you have to really be aware of this principle in a way that you kind of don't have to as much if you're just doing planetary magic, or if you're just doing rituals of the pentagram and hexagram. I mean, it brings these principles into play, but it's nowhere near as obvious and nowhere near as direct as something like trying to throw a curse at somebody, for example. Basically, the thing is that we are naturally aggressive and competitive. The idea of trying to create change in conformity with will implies that as human beings, we're going to have that aggression and that competition manifest itself in some way. And if we are ceremonial magicians in our magical practice, trying to create change in conformity with will, and we are leaving out the aggressive, competitive part of our will, what we're creating is essentially a deformity. It's incomplete. It doesn't have everything that it needs to be a total picture of that person and that individual. The question that brings up, of course, is what's natural, rational aggression, and what's irrational, pissiness, basically. Now, what's interesting to me is that a curse thrown by someone who's just being pissy as opposed to someone who has a legitimate justification, in my experience, is just as likely to work. I have never seen any indication that moral justification has enabled something like this to be successful or disabled it from being successful. I will say that it requires a certain kind of authority, and a person has to actually have that authority to be able to strike out at another person in that way. But that doesn't necessarily mean justification. It just means the ability to muster whatever quality of authority that happens to be for the practical ways that the curse or hex is being enacted. And we'll talk about that in an issue for everybody. Just to address a couple things of this in Thelema, one word that I heard a few people use was compassion, and I like the use of that word. In Liber Zadi, Aleister Crowley tells us this is compassion, and he defines compassion for Thelema, a rooting out of the weeds and a watering of the flowers. So to essentially nurture what is beautiful and good and productive, and to weed out or destroy what is vampiric, what is sucking the life out of everything around it. And I think that we can all agree that a compassionate gardener doesn't let weeds grow in their garden, because pretty soon they have no flowers, they have no vegetables, they have no fruit, all they have is weeds. So that is the attitude that I think that most of us, and I think even with people who are kind of not interested in using hostile magic necessarily, still approach it in the same kind of way. If someone is taking away from your life or taking away from the people around them, you want to get rid of that person. You want to move them out of your magical circle, certainly. And And for everything else, this magic is actually fairly useful for doing that. It can be just a kind of banishing, like you were talking about almost, just projecting someone away. I can think of one case in particular when I used hostile magic on a coworker, and literally they were just fired the next day. I didn't see them again. They were completely gone from my life. It was fantastic. I don't think anything necessarily too bad happened to the guy or anything like that, but he was just gone from my vicinity of knowledge or presence, which was very desirable at the time. I think there's three major reasons, essentially, that people are disquieted or dislike this particular subject in the occult community. I think the main one, or no, not the main one, sorry, the first one, is there's a certain, and people don't really talk about this, but I think there's a certain underlying fear of persecution. People want to tell themselves, or tell other people around them, it's like, okay, I'm involved with this stuff, but, you know, it doesn't make me dangerous, I'm not going to hurt you, basically, I'm not going to, and, I think that people don't really actually have this fear as much as they might have at one point in time if you told them you were involved in the occult. Like if this was the 60s and you told people you were involved with the occult, you'd probably have a very different social reaction. I don't know how people in this room have had it treat them in their lives, but I've definitely found that for the most part people are kind of mildly interested, mostly disinterested, and don't really care far beyond that. So I think the fear of persecution is something that's almost exaggerating the importance that secular society holds the occult in. I think it's largely dismissive of ceremonial magic. These things are considered to be kind of ridiculous on the wide scale. There's a few paranoid religious people who are, threatened by it. There's a few atheists who will completely laugh it off, and for the most part, people are not really engaged. The second one is a certain amount of peer pressure, which I think we do find in a lot of occult groups. People very much disparage the use of any hostile magic, disparage the idea of using magic against other people, and that creates an atmosphere where people they're not comfortable with it, they don't want to engage it just because it's a culture. It's a culture, and it really penetrates that culture. And the third one is the fear of divine retribution. In whatever form, we can use whatever language we want. We can say God, we can say karma, we can say threefold law, we can say whatever. But essentially what it comes down to is the idea is if we behave negatively, the universe reacts negatively. And I think that and I think everyone has to evaluate that question based on the evidence of their experiences. In my experience, that's not the case, but that's my experience, so I'm not trying to tell anyone else what it's like. What the danger that all three of these presents is creating the idea of anger or aggression as a black market ideology. There's a French political philosopher called Chantal Delsol who wrote a very interesting book called Icarus Fallen, and she's using this model in a more of a political way, but you can extrapolate it to a psychological sense or how it works with an individual, where she compares certain ideologies in Western culture today to the black market, like the drug trade. So, for example, there are these substances that are illegal. Their value is exponentially increased. They become adulterated with all kinds of other substances, which is we're not actually part of them due to, actually, there's a great HBO show right now, Boardwalk Empire, which talks about this with alcohol quite a bit. And you can see how when people are buying black market alcohol, what they're drinking is not like actual alcohol, it's mixed with other stuff, it's far more unhealthy, it's far more expensive. And this is true of ideologies too. If we turn aggression and anger and conflict into a black market in our own mind, in our own life, then it starts to take on all those characteristics of something that's underground. Aggression starts to come out at people that we're not actually intending to have it come out at. And it's actually, Freud very famously said that it's easiest to be unkind, I think I'm paraphrasing, unkind to the people who you love the most, who are closest to you, because when someone's always going to love you and they're not going to get angry at you, that's the person who you lash out at, because you know they're safe. When you're afraid to use your aggression at the people who are actually triggering it and actually creating it. What this ends up implying is we have to come to some idea of like what constitutes an enemy and what is the idea of an enemy. Do we believe we can have enemies? What does an enemy mean? I used an example earlier on of using hostile magic against someone and essentially just destroying the fact that they were an enemy. Now, I didn't word this any different